gentlemen, which one of you are leading us through this?
Mr. Chairman, I'll do that on this bill. And Mr. Chairman, what I intend to do is just really quickly cover the bill. If the committee remembers, it was requested at the last meeting on the recommendations of the State Treasurer's Office. They provided some draft language that wanted to be moved into statutory or LSO format, which I've done in this bill. So I'll give you quickly run through the bill, and then I'll let them take it and describe the policy reasons, et cetera. It's a pretty simple bill. It deals with both the investments in alternative investments by the State Treasurer's Office, as well as the selection of investment managers. And in both accounts on page 2 of the bill, whereas right now the selection of alternative investments is given to the SLIB board, right now this bill would change that to the Investment Funds Committee. That's in lines 9 through 11 on page 2. Then immediately after that, it specifies that the Investment Funds Committee can then delegate that authority to approve those to the State Treasurer upon a majority vote of the Investment Funds Committee. If you'll turn the page, then actually there's conforming amendments on the rest of page 2 and 3 that just allow that to happen. And on page 4, oh no, I'm sorry, then on, let me see, I've skipped a page here, one moment. Yeah, I'm sorry, and then at the beginning of page 3 and on to page 4, it talks about investment managers, and it makes the same change. Right now, those investment manager selections are done by SLIB, and under this board, that approval authority would be given to the Investment Funds Committee. And again, that delegation then can then be delegated to the Treasurer Office if that's what the IFC would like to do. Importantly, then, the only other change in the bill, a different subject, is on the bottom of page 4. We create a new paragraph 9. It specifies that in paragraph 8, right above it, that's why I've included it in this bill draft, it provides some reporting of investment or some information on investment manager selection and performance. And then this new provision on page 4 says the State Treasurer shall report to the board not less than semi-annually regarding the hired investment managers and the information disclosed to the State Treasurer under paragraph 8. So that is just requiring them to report that information then on. Again, and then on page 5 onward is simply conforming amendments that adjust for the IFC making those decisions rather than the SLIB board. That's really the content of the bill, and it's that that straightforward. The two things that I think I would mention to the committee just to consider, and maybe the Treasurer's Office would like to comment on, is kind of a practical implication of having the IFC make those decisions. And that is simply that the committee should be aware of that the IFC right now is exempt from the Public Records Act and the Public Meetings Act, or the APA. And so it might be something to consider. I mean, if they're going to make some of these decisions, maybe that would be something the board would consider, I'm sorry, the committee would consider whether we want to not make them exempt when making these decisions. The second question is just a practical idea of, does this bill, if it's enacted, need an appropriation? Right now, the IFC doesn't have significant funding, perhaps, to do these kind of things, and it was something that the committee may want to consider.
Very good. Questions on the bill? Okay, we'll turn it over to Mr. Fleming and Treasurer Meyer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'll start off and pass it to the Treasurer. Just for the genesis of this, the whole process is to be able to invest in multiple different funds in a timely fashion. So to just run through the process again. So in private equity managers or whatever, RVK, our consultant, needs at least 2 months to their due diligence on the fund. The IFC meets 4 times a year or quarterly, and then the SLIB meets after that. So there's an instance where we could be 6 to 7 months before we could get a manager approved. We've had opportunities that have come about that are really exciting, but if it's, say, well, when do you have to know? And they say, 2-3 months, we can't do it. So this process is something that would really allow us to act in a much more timely fashion. And we have prior precedents or whatever, that is kind of the operation of what WRS does, where Sam will work with his committee, his team, everyone else, and when he has a really good idea, then he can go to Dave and say, this is a great opportunity, and they do their diligence there, but they could turn it around in a very short order, and we just can't do that. So we miss a tremendous amount of opportunities. And with that, we have talked to the SLIB members, and I know Betsy is here to comment, and all of them in general like the idea, but just depending on the wording of the bill and so forth. So I'm not going to speak for them. But in the past, when we've done this, you said, well, have you reached out to the individuals? We have, just to hear what they have to say. I have not heard from Secretary Gray, but all of the other ones are in favor of it, generally speaking, depending upon the wording of the bill. So I'll leave it at that about why we need it, the interest in being able to execute in a timely fashion for a better opportunity to hopefully make more money for the state. Thank you.
Treasurer Meyer.
And it wasn't clear that this was exactly the way that the WRS does it, but the WRS board has the power to delegate or rescind. So in the places where we're on page 2, line 13, after delegate, I insert or rescind. That's on the alternatives. And then on page 4, line 4.
Senator Guru, 1 second.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Okay, let me get this a little closer here. Okay, so what we're doing on, I'll repeat, on page 2, line 13, after delegate, we insert or rescind. And then that, it was with the alternative investments. And then on page 4, line 4, we say may delegate or rescind. And how that works is that, as Patrick indicated in the WRS, that the salmon investment team will do their due diligence along with Makita. That's essentially the same thing that we do now. And then it goes to the IFC board in the current process, and eventually ends up in the SLIB board, which what necessarily we're taking the third leg of this out, keeping the IFC in there. Now, when Sam and his team says we've got a good manager, then the last step of due diligence at the WRS is that Dave Swindell takes a look at it as the chief operating, well, as the CEO, chief executive officer. Excuse me, and sees there if there's anything that looks out of order, and to my knowledge, Dave has done due diligence on that, but had never seen anything out of order, and it's summarily or ceremonially just approved from that standpoint. So essentially, that's exactly how it would work with these additions or rescind. So it's clear, and it's I always thought it was kind of understood. If they've got the power to authorize it, they have the power to take it away. But I wanted to make that clear. I know the governor had some heartburn with assuming the power of the state treasurer would have, and what would be the checks and balances. Frankly, I don't have that problem. We've had elected public officials, for years. Some of them were better than other ones in this particular office, but, I don't believe we've ever had any, I'd say, things that we couldn't recover from. It might have been some missteps from time to time, but never anything we couldn't recover from. So, and the same thing goes with any legislative office, any governor, any elected official. We are a republic, a representative republic, and from my perspective, I believe that we need some accountability in that vein, and that accountability remains intact in this particular area.
Okay. Representative Larson.
So I thought, Mr. Chairman, I thought I understood lines 12 through 15, and maybe I didn't. And so if I could get some clarification, Ian, either from you or from the treasurer, but the way I was reading this is that the Investment Funds Committee will have the authority to the Investment Funds Committee will be able to make the decision, that they'll have the authority to do that. But the Investment Funds Committee then could delegate that authority to one person, being the state treasurer, and there's not a time limit on that, that the state treasurer then would have the authority to move forward and make ongoing, have the authority to make, to approve alternative investments. Do I understand that correct?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I know our intent is to do it exactly the way that WRS does it. You know, if you need clarity and maybe not to get so much in the weeds, you would say probably as directed by the policy of the, you know, or you may say a sentence that said the implementation of this shall be directed by the policy of the IFC. And then that takes care of perhaps any confusion about how it would be run. It would be, you know, it would be, you know, by the policy of the IFC, which are the, I guess, the adults in the room that are you know, professional investment folks.
So, and I appreciate that, but I don't know that it answered the question. Maybe, Ian, did you draft this, or?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I did, based on language from.
As you drafted it, am I understanding it correctly?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, yes. I mean, I think the plain language doesn't place limits on how long this lasts or the authority the specific authority that's given. I think it contemplates that the delegation would be of all of the authority that the IFC would then be exercising. That would be then delegated to the state treasurer's office. And I'm sorry does that answer your question?
Well, and that's the way I read it, but I'm Mr. Chairman, so I guess and I understand, I hear you, Mr. Treasurer, say you would like to have that under, similar to what the retirement system is. And so I'm not sure that I'm understanding that structure well. Are you saying that in the retirement system that their Investment Funds Committee delegates that, has delegated that authority, or has the authority to delegate that authority to whom?
Well, it's not their investment committee, it is the board, the state retirement board, you know, by a majority vote can delegate that to the, basically the office of the investment team. And so that's what the delegation is there. It's to Sam and Dave, it's to the whole structure of the retirement system, you know, whatever that contemplates is that's the people that do that. And in this, I guess, the plain language says treasurer, but even in the Constitution, there's language that says that the treasurer shall do this. Well, it's the treasurer's office, and I think that's the understanding, even in the Constitution, that the treasurer himself doesn't do that or herself doesn't do that. It's the treasurer's office. But in the circumstances in the WRS, the chief executive officer signs off for one more check as to find out whether or not. Now, what is contemplated, I think, by people who think that they may have a rogue treasurer is that the treasurer wouldn't sign off on something. And in that case, you know, then that's why I put the words rescind in there to make it clear that that authority, that door swings both ways. And
Sure, Mr. Chairman, may I follow? So what's wrong with just leaving it with the Investment Funds Committee, of which the treasurer is a member of?
yeah, you know, that does a great deal in speeding up the process in that regard. But to get it to the same level of flexibility that the retirement system enjoys, we wanted to, we assume that we're essentially in more or less the same boat as the retirement system. And we'd like to have that governance structure, which they have.
And Mr. Chairman?
Treasurer Meyer, do you have a follow-up?
Well, I'll go ahead.
You're fine. Treasurer Meyer, on the same line of thinking, if we, instead of saying the state treasurer, we said the CIO, the investment funds committee could delegate that authority to the CIO. Would that way we have the quickest path forward to match these investments? Why does it have to be the treasurer or treasurer's office versus the CIO? And in that same context of treasurers listed, assuming it's the treasurer's office, if we do the CIO, then we get you to the investment as quick as possible.
Well, you do that, but then you have a problem with the statutory constructs that we have and the constitutional constructs as far as who is actually the individual that has the responsibility, both to the voters and to the state of Wyoming and to the office, and that is clearly the state treasurer. And
Mr.
so
Chairman?
you take that double check out of the system. And even your own staff said the state treasurer's office, he read it as it was the office, because that's the structure that you have when you say state treasurer. It's not necessarily the individual. They have, if something goes wrong, it's on their shoulder, whether, it's an employee or not. They take the responsibility. But in this case here, when you're doing managers, I think the responsibility of the managers is to the point where the state treasurer better understand who the manager is, what the manager does, the amount of risk associated with putting this manager in place and their performance. So you go over all those different things when you look at the due diligence, and just double check what the team has done, double check what RVK has done, and feel comfortable with it. Now, in WRS's thing, the chief executive officer, Dave Smudell, has always been comfortable. I can't, in my perspective, I can't imagine a time when necessarily I would feel uncomfortable with that, unless in case there was a situation where it would be performance-based and a manager was put forth that was in a third or the low second quartile in investment thing, and where we're trying to reach the top quartile, I would definitely have a lot of questions with the due diligence and with RVK of saying, well, is this the best we can do?
Yeah.
And so those are the only cases where I would think that I would say, hey, let's wait a minute and take a breath and come back. Or if it was a manager that had great reputational risk that may or may not occur, that we'd have probably a discussion about that.
Very
also.
good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Ian?
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to give some context for that as well, and it's, I think, supportive of what the state treasurer is saying, and that is that throughout these statutes, it does use the term state treasurer and doesn't mean only the physical elected official. Even in that same paragraph on page 2 on line 9, you can see that example, the state treasurer, original language, shall obtain the approval of the board, and that doesn't necessarily mean the state treasurer himself. So that's consistent with the way we use these statutes, to use that term state treasurer. But to also address your question, whether it could go to the CIO, at least the CIO is a statutory being here. And so if you wanted to reference him in the statute, that would work, at least from a statutory standpoint, because it is
Thank
a
you.
statutory
but
office.
Senator Guru?
And I would say.
One
that-
second, Treasurer. Senator
Okay,
Guru?
go ahead, yeah.
Well, no, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Okay.
and I would say, I can't contemplate any time when the chief investment officer wouldn't be on the due diligence team with the senior investment folks and the other people that have general knowledge of it, in the first place. So, that's the fox guard in the hen house. If you have the leader of the team say, I think it's great, and then he says to his inner self, yeah, I think it's great too,
Very good. Thank you. Senator Guru?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for Ian. Back to what you were talking about, what you brought on, the problem, the challenge that you brought up about open meetings laws and all that. Given the discussion we just had, if the IFC is part of the treasurer's office and something to work, after a manager was picked, someone asked a question, I'd like to see, make an open records request of the discussions that went into that, or emails or whatever else, wouldn't they then be compelled to do that?
No.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Ian.
Representative, no, actually, that's not how that works, because I guess it's fundamentally, the Investment Funds Committee works with the Treasurer's Office, but it is a separate statutory being and is specifically excluded, like by that name, Investment Funds Committee is excluded from the Open Records Act and the
Knew
MIPA.
there was a reason. I'm
So
just trying to
in this process, if the delegation is there, then yeah, you could compel our records because we are subject to freedom of information. But you couldn't compel what happened in the IFC meeting, because essentially those are always considered to be,
Executive
you
session.
know, executive. And the reason for that is to allow the professionals to have a clear and frank, open discussion without it leading to some possible repercussions in their own personal investing business.
follow up.
Follow up?
So then, based on what I just heard, then, so we're talking about a personnel issue that wouldn't be subject to that anyway, then, would it?
No, it's a contract, not personnel issue.
Man, I'm trying to help you out here.
All right.
I'm trying to help you out. You keep shooting me down, okay.
Trying to give you the lay of the land as I see it, I don't know whether you're helping me or not, yeah.
Representative Larson, I interrupted you a short time ago to let you regroup your thoughts, so.
Well, and so then, in listening to this conversation, it appears to me that you would rather just have the authority go to the state treasurer's office. Why have we got it going to the investment committee, and then they decide to give it to the treasurer's office?
Well, because they are our professional advisory committee. And I think.
I
it should
understand
be-
that.
Yeah, and I think it should be up for them to be able to, make the decision as to whether or not, they're going to get the intended results by the state treasurer's office doing these particular issues.
Right, so then, Mr. Chairman, then, so why not them just, because they can meet, if we're going to give them authority, then just, why not just keep it there? What's the necessity of, and I guess it is not a necessity, it's up to their discretion whether to delegate to the treasurer's office or not. But if they elect not to,
Then it goes back to them.
they still have the flexibility, and that's what I thought I heard in Jackson, is that you are really needing the flexibility to get these managers in place on these short-term investments sooner.
Yes.
And that the Investment Funds Committee was the one that wanted to do that, and I didn't realize that there was language at that time. I didn't realize there was a language that authorizes them to delegate that then to the treasurer's office, and I'm just struggling, Mr. Chairman, understanding why we need that step.
Fleming?
I'll let Mr. Fleming handle that, yeah.
Mr. Chairman, yes, Representative Larson, just to take a step back, would it be ideal to be able to do that, to have that same structure? Yes. But also because of the elected officials that are elected to watch after the funds and so forth, what we thought would be a better step to make sure that all of these investment decisions were vetted properly. So just to be clear how this actually works. The first step is our investment staff would look at the attributes of the fund. We get together, I work with them and say, okay, these would be like the top 3 funds that we're looking at or what have you. Then we get together with RVK and they have their funds, and then we go back and forth. And so then we come up and say, okay, this is the best fund. So then with RVK and the fund, then we present that to the IFC. And then the IFC, who is comprised of, as you know, very knowledgeable, influential people, could add comments or what have you and say this or that or what have you. And also, the SLIB board is part of a double hands length process of electing the IFC members. So you still have that kind of control on that. And that would just eliminate the one step. We'd still have the two other steps, but this would still be much better. And then just to be clear on this, what we were looking for is not a blanket approval, but a deal-by-deal basis. So it wouldn't be that they say, oh, anything, if IFC says, okay, we're going to leave this at Treasurer's office, we couldn't just go out carte blanche and say, okay, we're going to, this manager, this manager, this manager. Every deal we go through, and if it's a alternative manager, because of their use of leverage, typically their material terms and conditions are much more cumbersome and need a more thorough process. So in that instance, then historically, the SLIB has also approved not only the manager, but the material terms. And that is where what Ian is referring to, where you would have that process as well. So the IFC would then approve the manager and the material terms, and then that would be the process for us. So is it an easier process, what you're referring to? Absolutely. But it does remove part of their duty of overseeing us. And so we're trying to have a happy medium that, yes, let's keep the way it is, but still have that more flexibility with less time.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I can actually see the way it would most likely work, and this could be in all circumstances, could be in all circumstances, is that the approval of the material terms in that aspect, when you're looking at, private equity, private credit type things like that, that would continue to maybe to be totally within the purview of the IFC. But on the other ones over there, where you're just looking at a public equities trader or a trader for something else or another, whether it was fixed income or something that wasn't quite as involved with, the whole structure of how things are paid and all of that different aspect of it, that may very well stay with the IFC. They may want to really double take all of those things, because those are they're a little bit more complicated than just putting on a run-of-the-mill, manager.
Sure. Representative Larson.
Follow up. So Patrick, I hear what you're saying, but I'm confused with what I'm hearing you saying and confused with the answer that Ian gave me, which what I heard you just say, that it's not an extended authority to the treasurer. It's an authorization by authorization to select a manager that you would delegate that authority. And when each one of those exercises is over, that delegated authority has concluded, if that's the right term. But what I thought I heard Ian say was, once that you delegated that authority to him, that would be ongoing for multiple exercises. So if I could just make sure that I'm understanding, and I apologize to this committee for being confused in this, but.
Ian, we'll start with you and then go to Mr. Fleming.
Great. Mr. Chairman, I just was going to say that, no, and I understand why my language sounded like that, but no, the language in this bill does not require that the delegation be ongoing. And in fact, I think the language is broad enough that that's up to whatever the IFC wants to delegate to the state treasurer. I don't think this language would prevent the IFC from giving alternative investment decisions to the IFC while retaining alternative investment authority with the IFC while giving investment manager decisions to the state treasurer. I think this language is broad enough that they could structure that however they feel is appropriate and for whatever time period they think is appropriate.
But I just wanted to make sure it was ironclad clear that they could rescind it. And so that's why the proposal for the amendments, so there's no ambiguity in there, that it's up to the IFC. They're the ones driving the ship, and that, it's either on or off. And if they see something that they are really interesting, they might say, well, we want to have a report on this before you proceed with any intended approval, or they may just take it back and say, well, this one we're really interested in, and we want to take this from beginning to end. So there's flexibility.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson. What I was referring to is the process that we were looking at, how, the bill is written and what you're coming up with could be very different. But that was the intention from the IFC, that they would opine upon every decision. And as the treasurer mentioned, what they do with it and how it proceeds, that would then be under the purview from the IFC. But as it stands now and how we've done it in the last 10 years, we've never had an investment that hasn't been properly vetted by multiple entities.
And I don't think we've ever had any investment that was a manager turned down by the IFC. They've had some remarks from time to time that says, they're a good manager. I think there's maybe some better ones out there. And then we have the conversation with the IFC. Okay, let's find out who those managers are and see whether we can get somebody, a little bit higher. In fact, we're going to have some conversations with them on some different asset allocations, and we're going to try to involve the ISC directly in the beginning of the process instead of just in reviewing and offering comments. So they're sharp people. They've got some skill sets and some contacts out there that we don't have, and so we're going to start using them in a more proactive manner.
Okay. Senator Hicks.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to change gears just a little bit and go back to the permissible investments. And for my edification, it specifically talks about alternative investments. And so what I'm trying to understand is what constitutes an alternative to the existing investment portfolio, or is it truly alternative investment instruments? So if we could get some clarification on that.
Mr. Fleming?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks. The alternative definition that is used with, I don't know if it's broadly used across the world, but any investment that has the ability to use leverage and therefore would be a riskier investment is deemed an alternative. And that's where a long-only unlevered equity bond fund or equity or bond fund would not be an alternative. Any emerging market, what have you, as long as they're not using leverage, that is a normal one, where a hedge fund, private equity, private credit, real estate, those would be alternatives. I'm just using some examples.
So, follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Follow-up?
And I understand that's what I want to get clarification on, but this is specifically only be for those purposes, the IFC, can you delegate that authority to the treasurer, or just alternative investments? Under this, the way this is structured.
On page 2.
We're back in the municipal investments on line 14, so it's only specifically that the IFC could delegate to the treasurer to invest in an alternative investment. That's it. Nothing else. Just alternatives.
On page 4, it's the other classification of managers.
I don't want to get into the manager.
Okay, all right, okay, you got it.
I just want to make sure it's only this specific type of asset class that the IFC could, if they wanted to, delegate that authority to the treasurer.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, the alternative aspect of it, the intention is that the material terms and conditions would also be approved. And that was the intent of what we were trying to get across, is that they would be approving all of our investments, but also the contract, i.e. material terms and conditions, would also be under the purview of the IFC.
Yeah, I see that component, and I keep coming back. I don't know that it does that. That's what I would ask Ian, is where is that? Because this section specifically deals only with alternative investments. And so where is the broader approval? If you can just show that to me.
Mr. Chairman,
Ian?
the fact is, it's not there. I think what you're looking for, the statutes specifically and only call out alternative investments for special treatment, approval by SLIB because they're more speculative or more dangerous and whatever the reasons are. But the statutes pull out this type of alternative investments, and there is a definition of alternative investments in those same statutes, so it's clear what those are, and says that they're going to get special treatment. They have to be approved by the SLIB, and the proposal here is to approve those by the IFC. Now, there is also additional language then that requires, it's existing, and it's right here in the statute here, let me find it for you, that also talks about if the material terms of those investments change, then they have to be reapproved by the SLIB. This is a conforming amendment. This says now those will be approved by the IFC. But it is limited to, this statutory change is limited to that class of investments and no other.
So that gets back to what my concern is. This is a very narrow authority. And I thought what we were trying to do here was if there was an opportunity and even an existing asset allocation, that the IFC could improve that or delegate that authority to the treasurer. We may just be moving money from corporate bonds to some other fixed income. I don't think this would allow them to do that without going back to the SLIB, or am I wrong? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Ian.
Pardon? Mr. Chairman, I guess I don't know the answer to that as clearly maybe as what you're, Brian, did you have? I mean, I think Brian maybe has been looking at the statutes.
And there may be something else in the statute that gives the IFC, but this is so narrow, I'm worried that it constrains the ability for all these other scenarios that may happen, that we need to be a little more nimble. Now we have to go through the old process of, you got to get RVK, and then it has to go to the IFC, and the IFC makes a recommendation to SLIB, and then SLIB has final approval to go ahead and change an investment. And I thought that's what we were trying to get away with. This doesn't do that. This only deals with that very specific instance. So Brian, if you'd opine.
So Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, Ian's already described, I think, why alternative investments have been carved out. I think for the remainder of the investments that are under this, it would be subject to whatever the investment policy statement says. Would be, I mean, that's what governs, to my knowledge, how these other investments would proceed. I'd let Mr.
And
Fleming-
subject to the asset allocation is the definition of the assets. Yeah. So we can't, there's certain things that we can't do that WRS does do, and we don't address that. They can do overlays and use options in different ways. We don't necessarily have that direct authority to do that. And we're not seeking it in this bill. That's a discussion, I think, for another day.
Representative Larson.
So I think I'm reading the same book that Senator Hicks is, and I'm going to try and ask it because I'm still not clear. There's a procedure currently, there's a procedure to give that we follow that includes SLIB to approve all managers. And we're trying to be more flexible, more nimble to do that. And so we're authorizing the Investment Funds Committee, we're authorizing them to make those. But I agree with Larry, the only ones that allows us to do it for is alternative investments. And so if I'm mistaken, we're pulling in the whole scope of investments, we're just pulling out alternative investments and giving the IFC the authority to bypass the SLIB. Now, if I'm wrong on that, then
Mr. Chairman,
please.
Ian?
and address that, and that, yeah, you're right, I don't believe that's accurate. These are two separate parts of the statute. The investment manager provision is more broad and is not limited to alternative investments.
Okay.
Okay. Senator Hicks, Representative Larson, does that answer your question now? Or we kind of got it ironed out
Okay.
and ready to go?
So let me me see what I heard is as long as it's within the asset allocation, right? Treasurer's office has the ability to move funds around already without the approval of SLIP. And so if we say 20% in equities and 10% fixed income, and as long as you're staying within those, you can go ahead and move those funds within those classes, or even cross those classes without approving a SLIP, as long as you don't exceed those asset allocations.
There's a range and we can't get over the bottom of the top.
So that's what I wanted to get specific.
Yeah.
But this is specific to those alternative investments. You already have that authority, as long as you're within the asset allocations, to move that money around without having to slip. So whether you want to move X from this investment to this investment.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Mr. Fleming.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks. I just want to be clear on this, and one, Ian had reached out to us to review this, and so if there was a slippage, but I just want to make sure that the intent, I don't know what it says in the statutes or what have you, but right now, it's not the movement of funds between one manager to another. What we're talking about is the approval of a new manager. And so that is the part that if that was not clear, and we didn't talk about that before, but I would like to make sure that in our conversations with the other SLIB members, that when they said in general that they are in approval of this process, that was deemed that all new managers, not only alternatives, but the alternative and the material terms would be under the approval process of the IFC, and then how the IFC delegated that would be up to the IFC. But as it stands now, we have never once had any new manager that did not have to go through the SLIB for SLIB approval. And I'm not sure where it is or what have you, but that has been the process, how we've done it.
Mr. Chairman, and that's exactly what 94718 means. That's not the
Yeah.
first one. That gives us the managers, the higher manager.
Right.
I'm talking about the actual investment, and alternative investments, back up from 714 to 715. So there's two completely different topics in this bill. Is the way I read it, and that's what I'm focused on 94715.
9.
They're not, they could be completely standalone.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Yeah. So to your point, the manager thing I think is clear, absolutely clear what we're trying to do. I just wanted to clarify the existing procedures for, and why we specifically call out alternative investments, which I think you articulated why we do that. I just want to make sure that this procedure now looks a little bit more like what we do for all the other asset classes, other than alternative investments, fixed income, equities, MLPs, hedge funds, all that other stuff. As this brings this in more consistent with what the current practice is that you do now for moving money and for investing in alternative investments. This becomes very similar to what you currently do. Yes or no? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, without understanding the legalese and so forth, the intention was to have the same process that we do with the SLIB to just move to the IFC, so they would then be in charge of that. So if that,
Question.
okay, would you state that again then? I didn't understand, I'm sorry.
So it is, but what I'm trying to get at is it's asset classes. Alternative investments, it is its own type of asset class.
Correct.
We only call out in 715 that one asset class. And the question was, why is this different than any other asset class?
I'm sorry. Yes, Mr. Chairman, Senator, and that is because of the inherent risk of alternatives. With that leverage component comes a much higher degree of risk. So as soon as you implement a levered strategy, that risk goes up dramatically. And so in that, Also fees. Fees are a major part of it as well. So typically, you could have a magnitude of 10 times the fees in alternatives versus regular. And so those material terms and conditions are vastly different. Understanding process gates, fees, structures is very, very different. So having another set of eyes on the material terms is critical in alternatives, where it's very plain vanilla in the local investments. And that's why we're segregating that out to make sure that the material terms and conditions and the manager would be approved with the IFC, where that has never been done with a SLIB before either, that a regular large cap US manager would be, would have a material term and
That was
conditions.
the explanation I was hunting for, as to why is this carved out as a special provision within statutes versus the normal operating procedure. So that makes more sense.
And a little bit is to the IFC, they're completely adequate in assessing these because they're very familiar with the types of fees that are charged by these different alternative asset management companies.
Mr. Chairman, this makes complete sense to me, and IFC has much more expertise than our SLIB board does, and so they're really the ones that ought to be making the judgment call. Not that we don't have a great SLIB board. They have different professional backgrounds and different other responsibilities that do not have the expertise of IFC. So I just wanted to clarify why we're calling these out different. It's the risk analysis
Now,
associated.
I do want to make this,
Higher level of professional scrutiny, but we also need to be nimble. Does that characterize the purpose of the bill?
yeah.
Mr. Chairman, absolutely, that would be very helpful.
To
right,
be
I'm
clear, we're
I
only,
have to explain this someday to a lot of other members. That's why I need to be clear.
yeah.
Absolutely, sounds
Now,
good.
Now, to be clear, we're only talking about hiring. The SLIB retains their authority to fire a manager.
I get that.
Okay, and so,
not
at
changing
this
that.
point in time, I don't think that's problematic, and we'll just see how history prevails in the future and see whether or not that has problems with the lay people making investment decisions in that regard.
Okay. Any other questions from the committee? All right, public comment. Any public comment? I see some coming forward. You can stay there, just share the microphone if you would, please.
Slide out of here. Okay.
Said stay here, so.
Go ahead. Please introduce yourself and proceed.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Betsy Anderson, and I'm the Deputy Chief of Staff and General Counsel for Governor Gordon. So did want to speak with regards to this bill. Since the governor does serve as the chairman of the State Loan and Investment Board, thought you would like to hear his thoughts on the bill. He certainly appreciates all the work of the committee on this bill, and he really supports the treasurer's bringing this issue forward before the committee. This is an important issue to help the treasurer's office be more nimble and do the work they need to do. So while it is, the bill does transfer some authority from the SLIB to the Investment Funds Committee, I will point out, as has been mentioned a little bit, the SLIB does still determine the investment policy. In that investment policy are the benchmarks that the State Treasurer's Office has to live by. The SLIB still does determine the asset allocation, and the CIO here can correct me, but I always hear that's about 90% of your return is your asset allocation. And third, I think as the treasurer mentioned, the SLIB retains the ability to terminate managers. So if they question the performance of a manager and maybe want to be more aggressive than the treasurer's office is, they can step in and terminate a manager. But the governor does have concerns with this matter you've been talking about, which is the ability of the IFC to delegate this authority to the treasurer. And I want to start with, this is no reflection on the current treasurer. He has done and is doing a great job. But the concerns are really more, I would say, related to some structural matters. First of all, the state treasurer is an elected position, and we don't know who that will be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And so the second aspect is that you put a lot of authority in one person. And by doing this, and I understand the treasurer said that, you know, it would be his office and his staff, and they would be doing that. But that is his decision. There is nothing in the Constitution or statute or rule that says that's what the treasurer has to do. And so another treasurer could say, well, I just want to make those decisions myself. So that is the concern. And, you know, I think we've had great treasurers. My boss was the treasurer at one point. I worked for several of the treasurers, and we've had great treasurers. But unfortunately, some states can't say that. And some states, beyond not good, you know, they've had treasurers that unfortunately, you know, have been charged with criminal charges. So you have to think about that when you're thinking about, this is not the personalities, this is not the people that are sitting at the table right here. It could be a whole different set of people. So that's where that concerns lies with the delegation of the authority to the treasurer. I know the treasurer's mentioned, you know, this is what the retirement system does. But they have some structural differences that I think makes more sense for the retirement system than it does for the treasurer's office. First off, the retirement system doesn't have the benefit of an IFC. They have a lay board. The SLIB's a lay board. They have some people that have some experience, right? But no requirements that anybody have any real extensive institutional, large assets under management experience and expertise. And so they have delegated that authority to their staff, and that makes sense at retirement. This treasurer's office, again, same situation. You got 5 elected officials. Some of them happen to have investment experience and expertise, but some terms maybe not. But they have an investment funds committee that by statute has to have 7 years experience managing over $500 million. And I can tell you right now, I think every IFC member right now far exceeds the minimum requirements by statute. And so it really makes sense that they are the ones that make these decisions to help. As Patrick said, you've got this 2-step process of when the IFC meets, and then you're trying to wait in time when the SLIB meets, and it just doesn't make sense. And so that's one difference with retirement, and then the other difference is their executive director is not elected. Their board is picking their executive director, and their board is picking their executive director on who understands investing on an institutional basis for retirement systems, and that's their fiduciary responsibility. For the treasurer's office is an elected official. And I'm not saying, but people vote on elected officials for a lot of different reasons, right? And it's, you know, they all have their day-to-day operational requirements, but there's also a lot of work on the SLIB, the Board of Land Commissioners, State Building Commission, and other legislation that constituents in the states look to for help with these elected officials. So you don't know that you're necessarily going to get a treasurer who has extensive experience and extensive expertise in the investment world. And that's where retirement's different. That's the responsibility of that board, and that's who they should be selecting as an executive director. So I do see those differences, and with the IFC, it seems like that would be the best place to have the responsibility moving forward. And the governor, as chairman, does support that move. So, and I just want to say also, you know, again, this is no reflection on the current treasurer or any treasurer, but I would say when the governor was treasurer, he would not have wanted to change this up so that all the authority lied potentially with one person. So I think that's it. If you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them for you.
Senator Hicks?
Yeah, so, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Betsy, to address your concerns, I want you to, when we look at the language on page 2, and we go in there, and it says the Investment Funds Committee may, so it's permissive, it's not a mandatory, may delegate authority for alternative investments to the state treasurer. And then further safeguards that says it has to be a majority vote. So first it's permissible, and then it requires a majority. And I think you articulated very well that these people have very specialized expertise and a lot of background in there. And so when I read that, I just don't see, I guess I don't have a lot of concerns that the Investment Funds Committee is going to arbitrarily make a decision based on the nature of the treasurer's expertise or background, whoever it may be in the future or at any time in the future. Number one, it's permissive. So I'm assuming that those people are going to have a pretty good knowledge of what the treasurer's background is, have some level of working knowledge. And then even to get to a majority of vote, it's pretty difficult with that group of folks, in my opinion. And so, I mean, do you see that any different, that there's not some safeguards in there, that we're not just going to have IFC telling the treasurer to go out and invest in alternative investments? I think that's, to me, there is a lot of safeguards constructed in that. I think it's a tremendously high bar. First, to even get them to delegate, and second, that it's going to take a majority of those members on the IFC. So what's your thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, I think that decision is your decision and not the IFC's decision.
So-
That would, I think, would, and yes, I understand you think that's a very high bar for them. But I don't think it should be left to them to decide who makes that decision.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I may just
Follow up.
follow up. So you talked about the necessity to have that expertise, and particularly with these alternative investments and stuff. Doesn't that just argue that SLIB doesn't? I mean, other than the current governor who's got investment, none of those other SLIB members have that experience that you just talked about that's so important. And so,
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, I think that is one reason why he thinks that the IFC would be a better, place for these types of decisions. And I understand there is, and I think there's merit to the idea that this is the people's money, and these are the 5 statewide elected officials. But we are talking about a $30 billion portfolio now, and it's just getting way more complex than anything that I think we even imagined, 20 years ago. And so I started in the treasurer's office in 2004, and, they were just starting real estate. I mean, it was, and so I think, it's, as it grows, we have to adapt and we have to change. And I do think that this is one of those things we have to look at. And he feels that the IFC is the most appropriate entity to
Mr.
make
Chairman,
that.
just one.
Go ahead.
One follow-up. And so I think we need to be clear. It's what is the current asset allocation for alternative investments? Because it's not $30 billion. And so it's a very small fraction of the total amount of money that's underinvested by the state treasurers. And so what is our current allocation that SLIB has approved under this category?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, I'm just going through the numbers. I could add them up in approximately $5 billion when you add.
Percentage-wise, so.
Well, it's a percentage of the total fund would be different as opposed to the funds that could actually do it, which would be like the PMTF and Common School and so forth. But the Common School and PMTF or permanent funds are approximately 17 billion. So you're
What I'm trying
talking,
to figure out, what percentage in the current asset allocation within the state treasurer's office is allocated to alternative investments. That's what SLIB establishes, is those asset allocation. Do we know what that is?
I'll get the exact number for you.
Mr. Chairman, and I want to go back to, and so this kind of goes back to your concern about asset allocation, and you need to listen to this to correct me. Basically, what comes before the SLIB is any alternative investments, and they are typically done by fund documents, and they're typically, you're buying a partnership interest. When you approve investment managers, that's your typical traditional investments. That's your stocks and bonds. You're typically getting a separate account. You're doing a professional services agreement. That's a contract relationship. So when you put together the professional services agreements and the alternative investment securities that the SLIB currently approves, that is basically everything that is invested by the state treasurer's office except for their internal investments. Am I misspeaking? Every alternative, every investment that is invested by an exterior manager or alternative investment would cover every investment the treasurer's office does, excluding your internal investments. Okay, so your internal investments are what, 30%? What?
Approximately.
Yeah.
Yeah, approximately, about $7 billion, yes.
Of the 30 billion,
Of the 30 billion.
it's approximately 30%.
Yeah, approximately. If you put in the latter SAP, yes,
Yeah.
approximately, yeah, 25 to 30%.
25 to 30%. So what this bill covers is approximately 70 to 75% of the investments made by the office, correct?
That is
Yeah,
correct.
okay. So that's just what I'm getting at. I know you're focusing on alternative investments, and I understand that's not a large percentage because they have several funds that can't be invested in alternative investments at all. And so when you're limited basically to your permanent funds, that's a small world. But when you pull in the traditional the management agreements, then you're getting into, I don't know, do you still have a large cap exterior manager that,
Yes.
yeah, they do like $1 billion. Who is that?
That would be State Street is our.
Yeah, State Street. That State Street contract is approved by the SLIB. Or I take that back. The selection of State Street to manage a separate account for large cap stock is approved by the SLIB currently. And what this document would do, when it talks about selection of managers, now the IFC would decide if that's State Street. When it comes to an alternative investment, then that's in participation in a fund. And that's the manager selection, that arrangement, let's say it's the State Street for large cap, that's done in a professional services agreement. That's done in the state form of professional services agreement, at least when I was there. So I haven't been there for 5 years, but when I was there, they took the AG form professional services agreement. So that's why the SLIB doesn't really have to look at the material terms and conditions of the agreement, because it's done in the state form. But when it comes to alternative investments, you're now buying in as a partner on a fund document. So you've got a partnership agreement or LLC, and you're having to live by the document that the investment manager has. And then that's why they put in the agreement that those material terms and conditions have to be approved by the SLIB, because now they're very different, and you really have to be careful about what those are. But at the end of the day, this document basically applies to about 70% of what the state treasurer's office does right now.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, just to follow up to Senator Hicks' comment. So alternatives are approximately 4.8 billion, not 5. And that's of a $30 billion fund, that's 17%.
Okay. Other questions? Senator Guru.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure I got all this, kind of get all those convinced around. Betsy, the governor does not have a problem with the body of this bill, except for this one portion, a question about the investment, about 9-4-715, right?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Grew, his concern is the two provisions that delegate, that allow the IFC to delegate that to the treasurer's office.
Yeah, just follow up to the question about treasurers and rogue treasurers and things like that. I won't speak to that office. I'll speak to my own. You know, it's the way I look at it. The old Golden Dome survived me for 8 years. Now, they had to do a $300 million retrofit, but it still stands when I walk in the door. So if it can stand me, it can stand anything. So that's not what concerns me. What concerns me now, it sounds like, as the good senator said, we got two different concepts in this bill, one of which seems to be without question across the board about hiring managers. And I listened carefully to Ian when he talks about, when he said that about open meetings law, but I think I got it answered when we said the SLIB board can fire anyone. So if there was ever any doubt, ever any question, ever any thought that maybe someone on the investment funds committee got co-opted a bit by a prospective manager, immediately the SLIB board could fire him. And that wouldn't take an open meetings request. That would just take a call of a meeting by any member of the SLIB, correct? Correct? Okay. So.
Heads were nodding, they agree with your statement.
Yeah, heads were nodding in the affirmative that was, okay. So and once again, I want to, and I know we all do, we want to try to move this along. But I think where we're coming to, and I'll just say, I'm willing to move this to the next meeting in its current form, although I'll entertain motions between now and then. But at the next meeting, at the very least, we've got to decide if we're going to pull that one part out and have that as a separate bill so we can get at what you're trying to get at in the main body of the bill, which is hiring investment managers, which I'm very interested in, and not create a conundrum that we can't quite bridge, which is that other piece. And so if that was in two separate, and then we could argue the two separately and then let them stand or fall, because I'd hate to see one fall because of the other. There you go.
Okay. Any further public comment? I guess you seem to have wrapped up, Ms. Anderson. Okay.
I would just wholeheartedly agree with the good senator from the Mother County over there, that if the IFC can make the decision on all of these different things, and if they indeed are professional investors, is that they have a lot more acumen as far as hiring a CEO and in the treasurer's thing than the lay board that WRS has to hire Dave Swindell. Now, Dave's primary focus is to make sure that, all of the money is paid to the retirees that has to be paid. He has a dual purpose. The investment part of it that Dave has, he's pretty much learned on the job. He was hired, and all other directors are essentially hired to manage the whole shop. That's what I was hired to do, to manage the whole shop. And if the IFC, the professionals they are, makes the decision that me or a subsequent treasurer has the competency to have that delegated to them, I think I can rely on their expertise. Thank you.
Thank you. Further public comment? Pretty quiet room. Don't see anything on the internet. Nothing, no one's raising their hands. Okay, I think we'll bring the bill back up here. Committee, what's your pleasure? Senator Hicks?
Well, I was just going to second Senator Grew's motion to authorize these to be in two separate bills. And so we would have provisions in.
So I think the two separate bills, Senator Hicks, and I'm just going to paraphrase what you're trying to do based on the comments, is the section that discusses the investment funds committee can delegate that authority to the state treasurer is a separate bill from everything else this bill does.
I think 914-718 could be separated out into a separate bill. Could it or could it not, I guess, Dan?
Well,
From
Mr.
my
Chairman,
standpoint, we're just talking about investment managers now.
Mr. Chairman, so we're clearly talking about two different issues. I mean, there's one way to split the bill is take, as you said, there's investment manager authority and then there's alternative investment authorities. That could be split into two different bills. There's also the issue then of whether or not, if you're going to give that authority to approve those to the IFC, do you then want to also give the IFC authority to delegate that to the treasurer's office? That could also be brought into a separate bill.
So that would be my motion, and my concern is exactly what Senator, we don't want to jeopardize the ability to hire investment managers and wait 9 months to do that and lose all these great candidates. And so I really do think we need to segregate these two issues out and have two separate bills. And so that would be my motion.
Well, Mr. Chairman, but so which of the two? You're talking about the difference between alternative investments and investment managers, right? You want
Correct.
those two separate bills.
Segregate those two issues in two separate bills.
And both of those bills will allow that to be delegated to the state treasurer.
Correct. But there seems to be one that's a lot more controversial, and that's the alternative investment component versus just hiring investment managers, which SLIB, as my good colleague has pointed out, can turn around and fire if they don't like them anyway. So that would be I would make that motion, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Representative Larson.
So a question then, Senator Hicks, but then the conversation about delegating the IFC having the authority to delegate that authority to the treasurer exists in both. And do we need to, that seems to be am I understanding that correctly? And so does that need to be a separate consideration, or what's your thoughts there?
I just think the investment manager thing, and even that delegated authority, is just not that controversial, given the fact that you always have the oversight of SLIB to be able to reverse that decision. And so I'd still like to segregate those out and deal with those issues separately. And maybe it just requires IFC approval to hire an investment firm, and we strip that out. I just don't want that to get lost with the alternative investment component and those. I really would like to segregate the issues, and then we'll debate each bill and the merits of delegated authority separately.
So we're splitting the two bills? Or basically the permissible investments and the investment managers will now become two separate bills with the same concept. Based on the governor's office, and I too share the concern, as the second component of both of these bills still has that IFC delegating to the state treasurer and investing quite a bit of power that is now with the SLIB board into one individual. Whether rogue or not really is not the factor. It's you've moved from the SLIB board having that authority to now one individual potentially having that authority. And Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, I think I've shared with most of you coming in, my first read on that was that I had concerns with this, and I've learned a lot, and I apologize again to the committee for all of the probably uneducated questions that I ask. My struggle with it there is in the structure of the process, as I understand it, Treasurer's office has it, forwards it to the investment funds committee, our manager people, RVK, then goes to the investment, then the IFC, then there's potential that it can come back solely to the treasurer's office to make a decision. So they've had it before, and I'm not comfortable with having that authority be in there for an unspecified period of time. We don't have to make that decision, but I'm interested in having that be on a how did I write that here? For a specific alternative investment choice, they can take it, and then once that decision is made, the authority reverts back fully to the IFC, and they could do that repeatedly, time after time. I'm not saying, I'm just sharing that's kind of a thought that I have, and we can maybe mull that around next time, but just wanted to share that with you and give people a chance to contemplate that, throw rocks at me as I head home.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, one of the ways maybe to get around this is in the alternative area there is to go to the same process that we do now, is that irregardless of whether the treasurer votes aye or no, it proceeds to the IFC for the final disposition.
Okay, yeah, and we'll work on
You
some
know,
of that
so
language.
that's a thought, you know,
Yep.
that we have the alternatives there, you know, and then there's a review, and you know, without a negative vote by the IFC, it proceeds, you know. So there's some ways that you can give more protection in this case, and frankly, the thought of the treasurer having so much power, no matter who it is in this circumstances, with the total ability of the IFC to stop it in its tracks before it goes any farther. And I'll go back to the language adding or rescind, and then you know, and I'd like you maybe do that in the drafts that are coming forward. That's possible, because I think that actually keeps it totally in the hands of the IFC in cases that are non-controversial.
Very good.
Yeah.
So, Ian, I think we'll end up with 3 drafts for the next committee meeting. We'll have the existing one, and then we'll have it split into 2 bills. In the existing one, please include the language that the treasurer asked for on line 13, page 2, after delegate or rescind, and then the same language on page 4, just so that we have that covered as we look at this in October. And then also to incorporate Representative Larson's comment, some sort of language that the IFC may delegate the authority to the treasurer for the purpose of that investment or that manager only. So it would only be a one-time delegation. And we would include that similar language in both this bill as well as the bills as they're split.
Mr. Chairman, sounds good.
And you'll have to work that language that Representative Larson brought up, but you have the concept, I think, down just fine. I think I encapsulated that fairly well for you, Representative Larson. If not, throw something at me after the meeting. Okay. So with that, I think,
Just one other quick suggestion that, and you might say that in the circumstances where a new treasurer is seated, that the authority is automatically rescinded. And that way, when you go through a election cycle, you get somebody new in there, they don't come into the office empowered to do it on day one, that it actually has to go through the process of an affirmative vote by the IFC.
because it would be per issue, I think that would already be included, but our staff made a note of that, so we'll make sure that if it's not covered, that we have something covering that. Ian, on a statutory construction question, page 3, line 13, everywhere else in the bill, we reference the Investment Funds Committee, and then on that, we just call it the committee. Does that need to have Investment Funds Committee in advance of it, investment funds, or is it because it was already referenced previously in the same sentence, it doesn't need to be there?
Mr. Chairman, right, that's the reason it just says committee, but, just the same way it just says, well, although, never mind, board is defined, but I can absolutely do that. If you think it reads better with Investment Funds Committee, I mean, I'm always in favor of making it more clear, although I do think it's clear the way it is written.
Let's include it, just for clarity's sake. Very good. Any other questions, comments, concerns on 152? We've ridden along here pretty good on this, so I think we have it covered. We have a plan for the next meeting. Everyone seems to be ready to go. Okay, moving on to our next. Any further public comment on 152, investment managers, alternative investment approval? Seeing none, we'll move on to improving investment returns and flexibility, the endowment model investing. earnings, income, dividends. Ian, Brian, we'll let you start.
Mr. Chairman, I think I can handle this. I think I'll have probably the first discussion and the second bill, the first bill that we'll discuss as well. The first issue on the agenda is one that came up at the last meeting, and I'll keep this kind of quick. It's this question of, on the agenda, earnings versus income, interest, and dividends, and statutory fixes to the constitutional limits. I'll try to make this quick, but because I know this committee, you know, we've been through this a number of times, particularly this existing committee. The issue is simply this, that our Constitution, particularly with regards to things like schools and the funding of our permanent mineral trust fund and how it then rolls over into our general fund, these are important issues because constitutionally, it limits the expenditure of funds to investment income or interest. And that's used in a number of places in our Constitution. And the Treasurer's Office has interpreted that to create a problem. It means that only income and interest can be spent for the support of schools and for the support of our general fund, not earnings. And earnings, LSO is interpreted to be a broader term. It's a term that includes investment income and interest, things like dividends, but it also includes, importantly, things like unearned capital earnings. The Treasurer's Office has interpreted the limiting language in the Constitution to prevent it or to require it to have income-focused investments. That is, they need to earn, quote, income in order to meet their spending obligations. What they would like to do is have broader language that allows them to not have to have an income focused investment, but instead have a broader based, longer term, what I guess they call a total return strategy. So that's the issue. And then at the last meeting, the question was, okay, well, that's the constitutional language. In 2022, this committee brought 2 constitutional amendments that attempted to fix that. Those didn't get very far through the session. And so the question becomes, is there anything else we can do? Is there a statutory fix? So I've looked at this and I looked at what we did in our prior legislation. I think the short answer is that we haven't been able to identify something. And more specifically, since this problem is identified, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years when it's really been a primary discussion with this committee, all the legislation that we've done, even when we're doing just fixes to the statutes, we've changed that language. Our statutes no longer contain the word interest and income and interest or dividends. Instead, we've changed those things to the word earnings, which is a broader, more inclusive term. The places in the statute where that old language exists is the places that are refer to permanent funds. And permanent funds are those funds that are constitutionally mandated, and that's where the offending language exists. So in our estimation, it would be confusing to everyone trying to interpret and apply both our Constitution and statutes to make those terms inconsistent. And we don't, because the Constitution controls, we don't believe that that would trump, our changing of the statutes does not trump what the Constitution says. You know, it's disappointing because obviously it would be convenient to have a statutory fix, a way that we could add earnings to the Constitution, but we haven't figured out a way to do that.
Okay.
And I do have some examples if you want in places that we've done that. You know, and we've made changes both to the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund Reserve Account, the Common School Permanent Fund Reserve Account, the Excellence in Higher Education Endowment Reserve Account, in the compensation plans for the WRS, in tomorrow's scholarship, in the bill you'll consider later today. We've become very aware that the language is important and the use of the word earnings. And in all those ways, the places I just mentioned, we've made those changes. But the problem is that's not the way you get at the Constitution itself.
So question on that, Ian, it looks to me, part of the issue is the permanent funds versus non-permanent funds. And so on a non-permanent fund, we're perfectly fine using statutory language defined as earnings, and that would be consistent that those would spin off the earnings. Is that your interpretation?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, exactly, yes. And that's where we have all sorts of authority. And I think the important thing there is that we've really done that now.
Go ahead. Okay.
Just wait until you guys are saying.
He was. Go ahead, Senator Grew. He was asking a question on this.
Yeah, I'll bite. So what's the answer? Do we have a constitutional revisers bill? I mean, how do we?
Well, Mr. Chairman, correct. I mean, we've prepared two bills that have some fundamental changes to the concept. Well, I mean, they're fundamental changes to the Constitution, but they're easy. They changed simple words like income and interest to the word earnings.
Right.
And, they're relatively straightforward. I think that all of us here remember that when those went before the legislature in 2022, they didn't get very far. Because, it's fundamental questions about, what that means, because the word is simple and the concept is pretty complex. But no, I think that's right. I mean, I think the answer is a constitutional amendment.
Representative Larson?
Ian, if you would remind me, I think after our failed attempt on, and then when this idea was brought up again, we had a conversation about, was it Utah perhaps that was able to accomplish this, and we had, is this not patterned somewhat after them, or is this of our own creation?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative, I think what you're recalling there is that there have been efforts to change the act of admission, and that's with regard to schools.
Okay.
Because in the act of admission for those states, that's also got limiting language. And in fact, I think Brian may talk about that here. But yeah, that's the Utah, I believe, is the state that changes act of admission to avoid that problem, which would be another step we'd have to take when it comes to schools.
This is just in our,
State
right,
constitution.
and nothing in our active admissions.
Right.
It's,
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, on this constitutional, I mean, is there anybody that doesn't think that we need to get this done? And is there, we've been trying, I think we just got to keep at it till we get it over the goal line.
So remind me, Ian, and Mr. Chairman, if I may, I thought the stuff that we did in 22 was a little broader than just changing the definition in the Constitution. And I only remember the one, and one was a Senate file, and part of that I thought was broader than just trying to change the word. There was trying to move the entire thing towards a total return endowment model type of structure for our permanent funds. And that's where we really run into the problems in the Senate. I don't know, it was so much with just trying to redefine
Maybe.
income to earnings, but that's my recollection. The other one I don't remember.
Right. Mr. Chairman, that's right. This would be House Joint Resolution number 5, and it dealt with the permanent mineral trust fund changes in the Constitution. And you're right. I mean, it does more than simply change that language. In fact, it does a number of things. Right.
Well, that's,
I think that's where we ran into
Yeah.
the problem. So if we were trying to do something, Mr. Chairman,
Simple.
it would be just to simplify that constitutional, proposed constitution, and just change that definition. I think it would be much, much easier. So I would try to.
Ian, as I read these bills, though, it's not a constitutional change. It's an act of admission change that we would pass a resolution looking for our.
Mr. Chairman, it would be both, because it would depend on if you're going to deal with schools, then you're going to have a constitutional amendment for schools, then you're also going to need to change the act of admission. For the permanent mineral trust fund, et cetera, you don't have an act of admission.
Utah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the clarity on
But
that.
there's precedent for that.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think that's right. I mean, the idea of getting Congress to change our act of admission, it's happened in several other states, so that I think is possible.
For the kids.
So what's the process of doing that, Ian? Snuggling up to our congressional delegation and,
It's already existing, we do have a resolution prepared that asks Congress to consider the issue.
okay,
And I think Brian can speak to it, and I think he's going to later, but I think that was the process that some other states have, they pass a resolution asking Congress to address it.
Okay.
okay.
Other comments? Questions?
Mr. Chairman, we're entertaining the question I would have for the want to go ahead and direct the LSO to draft the bill up for proposed constitutional amendment, just to change the definition.
Isn't that the second one?
That's,
It's not even a bill. So we have to authorize them to draft that bill. It's a joint resolution. I guess if the committee, I think it's a good idea.
I think we should try it.
yeah, that's, I think we'll go ahead and have that bill drafted.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, so I think what that would mean then we'll do it similar we did before, probably 2 resolutions for constitutional amendments, one for schools, one for the Permanent Mental Trust Fund, and then probably a second resolution that draws out the act of admission and requests that of Congress.
Yep. Okay.
All right.
And then that brings us, everyone content with that for our October meeting? And that brings us to then draft 153, which is the modernization of non-permanent funds. This is a spending policy bill that we've had before for the Cultural Trust and the Wildlife Trust.
Mr. Chairman, I'll talk about.
Go ahead,
those
Ian.
ones as well. I think the important thing on this, well, one of the important things that this is the flow chart that you have on your table. I think that, I'll try not to go in any questions you have, I'm happy to answer, but we've talked about this bill, I think at least 2 meetings last year, and so it's pretty well vetted. It got all the way through the session last year until 3rd reading, I think, in the House when it failed. And so it's something you're probably fairly familiar with. The idea here is we have 2 statutory endowments, and the important thing is that they're not constitutional, so we can do what we want with them. Currently, they're statutorily inviolate by their statutory language. The idea here is to take away their inviolate status, but not for the purpose of making them a free-for-all, but instead imposing on the corpus of each of these trusts an annual spending policy. And what this does, we take the annual spending policy as set at what we think the fund, our best estimate of what the fund can maintain in investments, plus a little bit, as was discussed last year with the treasurer's input, about what would allow it to grow slightly to inflation-proof those funds. So that's the spending policy. And the idea is we take these 2 accounts, we allow them in these bills, it does for the first time allow them to be invested in equities. We invest these funds, we roll all of the earnings back into the corpus of these funds, and then every year, the only thing that comes out of that corpus is a spending policy amount. And that spending policy amount is then the amount that funds grants for both of these programs. So it's a pretty straightforward process, really. It allows for the first time to try out, and I think that was the discussion last year, it was the first time that it allows us to try what is more of a pure endowment model for statutory trust funds. And the important thing is, what it means to be an endowment model in this circumstance is that whenever you make one of these trusts have investments, but then it has to have a amount come out in a yearly amount of income, and that was a problem we were just talking about, it requires an investment strategy that creates that income. Here, the idea is to simply say, here's the corpus, and you have to take this amount out every year, the spending policy, but you can use any asset in that corpus to get there. So you can use, you're going to have to realize your unrealized earnings, or you can use any investment class. It gives the treasurer's office a lot more freedom to meet its obligations through whatever is the most advantageous, whatever they need to get rid of, or is at least not as damaging to get rid of. And that's why this is more of an endowment model than any other system that we have right now. So, I think that, again, I think that the important thing here is that, yes, we take away the inviolate nature of the trust funds, but it's not to open them up to anything. It's to open them up to simply that spending policy every year. And so I'm happy to go through the bill if you'd like me to, page by page, but that's what it does.
I don't think we need to. Representative Larson?
So the question that I have is, you explained that, Ian, and you say we don't make it inviolate for the sake of spending, but for access and flexibility. But then how is it protected from prematurely or unauthorized spending, or spending outside the intent of the corpus?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative, the only way it is because the only statutory language that allows any withdrawals from those corpuses is that spending policy language. Now, but as we've had with everything that's not a constitutional fund, it's not any better than the statutory language that created it.
Sure. Thank you. Got it.
Okay.
I agree.
I think we're okay with it. We're lacking a bit of a quorum to take a formal vote on it today, so I think we'll carry it to the next meeting. Two things or one thing, but for both accounts. There was a discussion last year that to make these endowment models really work, you needed to have a minimum amount of funding available. And I think we were trying to get the Cultural Trust to 30 million, if I'm not mistaken, because that's what the Treasurer's Office felt where it should be, or maybe it was 5 million in the reserve account of the Cultural Trust. But trying to figure out, there was a dollar value attached to this to fill both of those to where the investment side made them function properly. If we could have a copy of that.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I think that might have been a different bill, though, because we had taken we had funded two accounts for purposes of getting them to the $5 million limit for
Okay.
Pool A.
Okay,
And so
that's what it was.
we funded those to get to
That's
the
what it
level,
was.
because that was the testimony of what they required.
That's what it
I think these, particularly the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust is almost 200 million.
Yes.
And yeah, so I think that might have been
Okay,
a different.
just wanted to make sure we could cover the investment side of it. So yeah, we'll move this to the next. Oh, yes, Polly? Can you grab the microphone for the online folks? I'm sorry.
No problem. Polly Scott, LSO Budget Fiscal. Mr. Chairman, just to chime in on that conversation and maybe help you recollect, that was in the year prior. There was a $9 million appropriation into the Cultural Trust Fund to get it up to about that 30 million. And then there was 10 million appropriation into the WNERT to get it up to about 200 million. So that was not this year, but prior year.
Perfect. That's what I was thinking of. Go ahead, Representative Larson.
Do we have an income account already in the WWNRT?
We do.
And what's that balance? So that would put it over the 200 million, right?
Mr. Chairman, I can ask Polly, I'm not sure about and did you mean the income account or the actual trust account itself? Because
The trust account is about 2, but I thought we had already didn't we set up a spending policy, a spending account for that to leave the corpus alone?
Mr. Chairman, that's statutory, so that's correct. There is an income account right now to which earnings are deposited, and then the grants are made from that account.
Right, and so my question was, is what's in that account as well? The income account for the WWNRT?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Larson, I don't have that number for you right now, but we will follow up with an email. We can't actually get into Wolves remote, so we'll follow up to the committee with an email.
So normally, under the current scenario, it spends off about $8 million a year for expenditures. But keep in mind, we have power company mitigation money in there, a lot of other money, and what happens with that account, those funds may be obligated, but they may not be paid out for 2 years until the project's completed. So my recollection is there's well over $10 million.
I think this is the last year for the Rocky Mountain.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, there's other ones out there, and so that income account's always going to fluctuate. There may be somebody come in tomorrow and donate $1 million for wildlife crossings that would go into that income account, so
That's where our cheatgrass mitigation money went.
I think we did put it, there was
Yeah.
some hiccups there, but that's where we put that last year, was the cheatgrass.
Okay. All set, Ian? Thank you. Thank you, Polly. All right, up next, we are just moving on to our next topic of the afternoon, state agency pool investment limitations. Mr. Fleming and Cheryl, come on forward. Certainly appreciate you taking the time to reinforce our knowledge on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is, per your request in the last meeting, to just do a one-page overview of the things that we're doing. So with that, I thought it would be better to have Cheryl O'Connell go over it because she actually manages the fund. So if you want to get into any of the in-depth questions, she would be the person to ask. Cheryl is in charge of our vast majority of fixed income, approximately $12 billion. So even though you hear about the alternatives and all the other sexy things, she's in charge of the boring bonds, but a significant part of the investments. So with that, I'll pass it over to Cheryl. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'm happy to go through the entire memo, as Pat put out here, or we can just focus.
There we go.
I'm sorry. I'm happy to go through the entire memo. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm Cheryl O'Connell, Senior Investment Officer, in charge of the Fixed Income Group. And Mr. Chairman, representatives, happy to go through the entire memo as it's put together here, or, happy to answer any specific questions. We do manage the portfolio as it's outlined as a ladder structure so that we can maximize the yield on the portfolio. We've added different tools allowing us to do that, including expanding our investment universe. But I'm happy to go into detail on any of it or keep it as short as you would like at this point, so.
You share what you think is pertinent to, as I said, reinforce our knowledge on this topic.
Okay. So the characteristics of the pool really are three main things, is that we're focusing on the liquidity needs of these funds. As Patrick had mentioned, the pool is around $5 billion in assets. Only $300 million of that is in cash. And so we are using that cash to pay the bills, basically the expenses for these funds, for the 400 different agencies that are part of this pool. And so we're using that cash, and it's necessary to keep everything very liquid in the portfolio in order to do that. We're not allowed to take any losses on the portfolio, so if we were to do that, it would have a direct impact on cash balances, potentially sending those negatives. So we want to keep that cash positive at all times. And then finally, the nature of the pools, as I said, this is essentially the checking account for these different agencies. And so we're trying to keep the assets as liquid as possible. So the implementation of the ladder strategy that we have in place does have, it's a way for us to recognize, to invest the portfolio internally, excuse me, without having to take any gains or losses within the portfolio, any losses within the portfolio. We're investing in different maturities across the interest rate curve out to 4 years. We're buying these at a discount to par value, and we're holding all of the assets to maturity. By buying them at a discount to par value, say 95 cents on the dollar, they will mature to par value, and that will ensure that no losses are taken in the portfolio. Only time we might see a loss would be in the event that the U.S. government defaulted on our debt, or we had to liquidate the portfolio, or we had to liquidate the portfolio immediately. One of the features of a ladder portfolio is the convergence of yield over time. It converges to the highest ladder structure, the highest rung within the ladder structure. And that simply is because in a normally shaped yield curve where you're being paid more to invest in longer dated securities, in a ladder structure invested between overnight securities out to the 4 years, the shorter, lower yielding assets will mature, and you'll be reinvesting that cash into a longer duration asset or into a longer maturity asset, presumably at a higher yield. So it'll push the yields out in the overall portfolio. As you were just speaking with the Pool A allocation, they have moved two funds out of the state agency pools, allowing to earn higher yields for those pools, and, for those agencies. So right now, anything that's over the $5 million threshold and has very low liquidity needs, we have the ability to move out of those funds. And then finally, as I stated, we're willing to, we've expanded our investment universe. We've obtained approval from the State Loan and Investment Board to invest in short maturity, high quality, non-US Treasuries securities. And so that would include agencies, AAA rated sovereigns, and supranational organizations, as well as high quality corporate bonds. Anything that is not AAA rated, we can only hold for a term of 1 year. And because of that, it really limits the default probabilities on those bonds. And if you look at the chart that's in the handout, it shows, for the ratings, the maturity year for 1 year out, anything below AAA is only 0.1% of default. Same thing, investing in something other than US government out 4 years, it's, even at AAA, it allows us to only risk 0.1% as well. So very minimal risk. So finally, if looking at if we were to try and add higher risk investments within the portfolio, it probably would necessitate adding a reserve fund. And in those cases, generally recommending 2 years of agency spend would be the most important thing to do so that we have adequate liquidity for the fund if necessary. So finally, as Patrick has illustrated in the past, right now that we see this as our optimal strategy, the ladder portfolio, and taking money from other higher yielding assets to fund a reserve account probably would be a less optimal way of managing the overall portfolio. Are there any questions that you have on this?
Questions regarding the state agency pool and why we have $5 billion sitting there and not overly invested, but it's quite simple. It's a liquid account and it's rapidly moving in and out all the time to where we can't count on it for an investment vehicle. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's just the nature of the beast. Any questions?
Real quick statement, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, that just points out that, bonds are not boring.
Bonds are not boring. Okay, very good. Representative Larson.
I do a little bit, you talked about the need to meet the cash needs and that a reserve account you manage that, but a reserve account is good, but then your conclusion notes that a reserve account is suboptimal. And so do we need a reserve account or?
No, at this point, we're not recommending that. We think it would, as you said, we would be suboptimal. We are not using a reserve account, which is why we can't take the losses. But the way we have the portfolio structured and holding things to maturity and buying them at a discount to par is avoiding any losses within the portfolio.
And Representative Larson, reminder, this is a reserve account for the state agency pool.
Right.
And so they're
Right.
saying, don't move money from the LSRA, which is generating well,
Right.
to create a
Exactly.
reserve account in this regard. They have a more economical approach or better approach to accomplish what's needed, so.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, Cheryl, for being here today. We certainly appreciate the information. Ms. Scott?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I was able to quickly phone our friends in Cheyenne, and the balance on that WNERT income account is $48.4 million. So higher than expected.
48.4 on the Wyoming Wildlife Natural Resource Trust income account, Lloyd. Okay, very good. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Patrick. All right, moving on to I believe our last topic of the day. Oh, Brian?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just wanted to get some direction on the 25 LSO 127. That was a bill draft under the prior topic. That was the draft based on 2023 Senate Joint Resolution 1 that would basically a resolution to Congress to amend the Act of Admission. Happy to comment on that or proceed however you wish.
I think just bring it to the next meeting unless you see concerns with it. Otherwise, it's just a bill.
Mr. Chairman, no concern. I would respond. I don't recall if it was Representative Larson who asked the question about, the resolution. So I would just note two things about that. First, the resolution is a bit unusual in that it basically proposes changes that Congress could make. And then second, this is kind of hearkening back to the 2022 interim, so a couple of years ago, but there are 3 states that I was aware of and that I'm recalling that have amended their active admission for similar purposes. And I don't recall which state did it which way, but at least one of those states, it appears that it was simply a matter of that state, someone contacted their congressional resolution and they got that included in a big omnibus bill to amend their active admission. So, another state I know did a more formal, here's a resolution, and then, but Idaho did as well with, I think, a resolution, so.
Yeah, I think, looking at it, I think that it's in good shape for a final approval at our next meeting. I didn't see any concerns with it. It's fairly cut and dried. So didn't mean to skip over your handiwork or your fine work, Brian, but we did want to move forward with that as well as the 2 Wyoming constitutional amendments. Okay. Generational fund. Treasurer Meyer. Or Brian, do you want to talk about your memo? You did the research on what other states' generational funds include.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just make a couple of broad comments. You should have a memo. This is 8-01 that just gives an overview of 3 sovereign generational funds: North Dakota's Legacy Fund, Norway's Government Pension Fund, and Australia's Future Fund. I think what I would note about the memo about each of these funds is that they each have a different legal foundation with different requirements for the creation and the operation of that fund. If there were to be interest in creating a fund, it seems the threshold questions would be the legal foundation. So should it be constitutionally based, statutorily based, the source of any sort of seed money or funds, and then any requirements or restrictions on the investment or expenditure of the funds. I'm happy to answer further questions, but that's just a very brief overview of that.
Treasurer Meyer.
Yeah, I thought this was a very interesting memorandum. The things that really struck me was in, I believe it was North Dakota, they had like a 50% sweep of all mineral revenue. In Norway, they had a 100% sweep of all mineral revenue, so to go into the fund. So they have a lot more going in, and so in these circumstances, they're a lot more liberal with the disposition of the revenue, because they have a lot of cash flow going in, so they can take a lot out. That being said, I think what we're looking at is trying to come up with a Wyoming model, and I think the genesis of that is something that doesn't spend the money for a great deal of time and allows it's a different way to invest it. And I think CIO Fleming has a couple of comments that he'd like to share with you at this time about how we're thinking about investing it and in that type of a situation.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Mr. Fleming.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Treasurer. One thing that I just want to comment is a big part of my job is to look at your asset and liability mix, tenor matching. You want to match your assets and liabilities. And I'm part of the CRAG. And one of the things that we do is estimate our revenues, as you know very well. And one of the things that I feel that you don't hear enough about is potential loss of revenue in some of the assets that we have. So the CRAG forecast is on our coal revenues. We're going to see a 30% reduction in volumes in 5 years. And if you straight line it, obviously it's 60%, because all these the power gens are going to be mothballed. And what does that mean? That's a loss in revenue over 5 years of 1.1 billion or 2.2 over a 10-year period. $2.2 billion. 228 million a year. Where are we going to get that money? So that is something that I spend a significant amount of time in looking at. Okay, whether it's 5% spend, all these different things, that's something I look at. So with the Treasurer's plan, when you're looking at it, and whether it's New Zealand or any of these other ones, the power of compounding, as Albert Einstein has said, it's the eighth wonder of the world. They who understand it receive it, and those who don't pay it. And I love to receive, so I don't want to pay it. And so looking at this, how important this could be for our future generations. And so you just look at it and say, okay, and we could just take $1 billion or whatever you want, any number that you want, and looking at it. The beauty of this is that you don't, if you're not distributing the income, which we talked about, the power of compounding, you are able to compound at such a higher rate because you're not distributing. And so if you just take a basic, rule of 72 and saying, okay, let's just take 10% to make the math easy, on $1 billion, so of 1 billion in 7 years, it turns to 2 billion, another 7 years, turns to 4 billion, and another 7 or 21 years later, you're at $8 billion. That, to me, is extremely powerful in offsetting some of this income in what we're looking at. And so in that instance, what you can do is you can take, let's just throw out a number, 80, 85% of your assets and having them in very, very high yield type of returns, which we can't do in any of our other funds. And we could put it in there and compound at a higher rate than what we're seeing now. Take these opportunities that you can only do if you don't have that liquidity, and be able to make a significant amount of money that could potentially offset this loss of revenue. So I just want to state that I don't think people are focusing on this loss of coal revenue that we have, unless things, there's nothing out there that will point that out, that we're not going to have a drop. And so where are we going to get the money? And so with that, I just, highly, highly recommend trying to look at something like what the Treasurer is proposing and see whether or not we could do something to potentially have this offset of income for our future generations and loss of income that I am highly, highly, highly confident we will see a loss of coal revenues over the oncoming years. So with that, I'll pass it back to the Treasurer.
Treasurer Meyer?
Yeah, and I think this would take, I would hope, that the possibility of a constitutional amendment, but notwithstanding that, I think that you could basically just have another fund, just like another PMF fund, but maybe it's a PCF, a permanent compounding fund or something, You guys name it. The name isn't important. What's really important is the results. There's a few things in there that we would probably have to consider in this. And one is, as CIO Fleming said, that, you're looking at 80, 85% of risk assets. And that's not really contemplated in our reference portfolio of a 70-30 split. So more, in this case, you might segregate this to an 85-15 reference portfolio. That would allow, for the 15% is allow for liquidity in the downtime, so you can invest when the market is low, and so you essentially at that time when the market turns around, that investment will make you considerably more than leaving it in a fixed asset. But you do have to have those liquid types of investments in that 15%. And a reference portfolio allows you the flexibility that we've had in our other portfolios. And I think that flexibility has substantially driven the returns that we've had. We're adding almost $2 billion a year between basically contributions and returns. But I think the reference of the compounding fund would be able to substantially, generate a lot more of that on a slightly higher risk-adjusted basis. But with enough diversity in the kinds of risk assets that you essentially still don't have all your eggs in one basket. I think that you would have to have, I would hope, I would say that you would want to at least double it 3, if not 4 times before you made a distribution. And then when you make a distribution, that I think would probably be up to the future legislators to make that determination. Or you could say, we're going to make that distribution back to the permanent funds or back to the educational funds. If you make it back to the educational funds, at least on the first one, then one of the use cases on that, which is kind of the flavor of the day, is to be able to reduce taxes in the long run on education. And we all know that there's a lot of different use cases for that. Replacing the energy revenue is essentially paramount. What you do with that with those replacement funds, I think you can use a little bit of forethought and see where that's really going to be impacted. And where you put that money would make a lot of difference between, what future generations pay in taxes and basically the quality of education, quality of life of the people in Wyoming. If we don't do that, the problem that we're going to run into is that you're going to get to the point where, all the easy to get to money in the permanent funds has been taken. And then essentially what do you do then? Is it going to be, I think the first thing you'd probably see, okay, we're going to raise sales tax by 3 or 4%. I think it's going to be that big of a hit if we actually don't prepare for the cliff that we're dropping off of. And I think we have to be prudent. I think we can't squander our future. And that is going to be, I know there is a huge appetite for, maybe not saving as much as we should have and using that for this current generation. But I think, hopefully Wyoming people feel a little bit more, I guess, sense of I guess, what the future generations are worth.
Representative Larson?
Thank you. Treasurer Meyer, then, kind of what we've been basing this conversation off of, and I realize there's a lot of variables in it, but let's just use the scenario we've used on coal, we lose coal. But that severance and royalty, for the most part, really comes back to the general fund side, right? The property tax and the ad valorem would go to the other side. And so I think as we try to sell this idea and identifying, if we shift all that to the education side, which is good for the education side, but it leaves a gap on the general fund side. And so then where do we cut there? And right now, the wheel that's squeaking the loudest is the property tax side, right? But that doesn't mean, but taken from there doesn't mean that it satisfies the greatest need. And so I would just encourage, as we had the conversation, to have a thoughtful conversation about where the loss is going to come from and how we replace that loss, and if there's additional losses that we contemplate, how we accommodate that as well. If that may,
Yeah, I think in my original use case, what I did is that I actually had $2 billion, ran it out to where it quadrupled. You ended up with $32 billion, and I took $12 billion off of that. And I split it from where I thought the donor participants were going to come from. And at that point in time, I think if you split that 12 billion, and I think I had a billion coming from the LISRA, so 6 billion would go back in this case with the billion, 3 billion would go back to the LISRA. And if you, the other constituents that I had is that there'd be some distributions, that was going to be general fund money out of the PMTF and then probably other general fund money that would represent a share going back to that. So I split it basically 50% to the LISRA and 25 to the school foundation and 25 to the corpus of the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, thinking that I'd like to have it in the corpus on those other parts, but if you put the lion's share to the LISRA, then that essentially, that goes back into the process where it could be reappropriated to the fund, or it could be reappropriated for the things that were needed to be done. And with this, with the seed of, basically it'd be about, I think it was 37.5% split when you did that, but the rest of that would remain in the fund as seed. And then as you're doubling that, because you start with a larger amount, you can just get to a point where you have a critical mass. And then when you get to that point, it wouldn't take too long to get to $100 million. And then if you distributed $30 or $40 billion, in that same time period of 25 to 30 years, then that would make such a huge difference. And you'd be, I guess, at a point of no return from the standpoint of being able to fund the permanent funds, being able to fund the LISRA and fund the general funds. But at the same time, if we continue to grow at that 2 billion pace, this $30 billion that we have would essentially end up, in 20 years, you'd have another 40 billion. So in 20 years, you'd have 40 billion that was in that sleeve. And then another, at $1 billion, you'd have another 12 billion, or probably close to 20. Now you probably have closer to 18 billion at that time that could be distributed where you had holes. But, the whole premise is that, would you rather have taxes, or would you rather have your investments work for the people in Wyoming? And what we want to do is basically do the latter. And as these two are growing, and your compounding fund is growing, at some point in time, it may be premature. It may not of 25 to 30 years, because both of them are growing. You may have enough excess returns coming off that you could proportion that out, appropriately without, and actually be able to decrease your taxes, and at the same time provide the services at a level that we need. Because you're going to have, schools in 30, 40 years, you're essentially going to have to replace practically every school in this state, because of just, it's going to be close. But you would probably have the money to do some of those things. I know in the area of the WRS, if you had $165 million and you got a return slightly higher than the 10%, in 30 years, you'd have $1.5 billion more than what the liability is for the retirement system now. And so that's another use for that. And depending on how creative you want to get, you could parse those things out as they go into it. But I caution about parsing out more, or earmarking more than half of it, because that gets really complicated. Even today, when you parse out the returns of the general fund, it's kind of like a mini pool A almost, So, there's a lot of, I think, things that could be done. It's really up to you guys. I think all we're bringing to you guys is the opportunity that we know exists. And it's really up to you to say, okay, what do we call this thing? Where's the money going to go? When should it be distributed? I would say a minimum of 3 times double, but hopefully 4 times double. Because remember, at the same time, these other funds hopefully will be growing at that same clip. Now, if you're getting right into how much you got to replace, essentially, we used to get over $200 million going into the PMTF, but that's when we had two points going to it. And then that went to the school foundation, and then that was split off for reoccurring expenses, but only a small part of that being retained in the school foundation. So today, you're about 80 million for each point. And so that's what you have to replace today. Now, that's going to diminish because in how many years will be down to 40? another 10 years, 15 years, if that, so, yeah, so that goes down, so you have to replace that whole 80 million. And it just depends on keeping up with the general flow of your current permanent funds, but augmenting that, with the compounding fund.
Thank you. It's a good idea. We certainly all appreciate it. Patrick, question for you. Say we start, finding $1 billion to start with is going to be a little bit of a stretch to create this account. Finding 50 million might be a little bit more plausible, and I'm of the opinion that anything's better than nothing. But say we start with 50 million in this year, and then next year come up with another 50 to add to it, and the following year 10, and we contribute occasionally, but with the big goal being that no withdrawal can occur. Does this still work as long as the concept is that the no withdraw side of it is in place, even if we're adding new funds coming in?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely, it does work. It just depends on, as the treasurer is saying, starting balance, but if you can increase that, the power of compounding is even magnified.
Sure.
And, the only thing that I would add is, when I started, the LISR was a fraction of what it is now. It's grown dramatically, and, there's all kinds of different options for it, but, a little over 50 years ago, your predecessors, started these permanent funds.
Right.
Just think of where we would be right now
Right.
if we didn't have these permanent funds and what they've done over 50 years. And what the treasurer is proposing is a little bit more of a turbocharged.
Right. Well, and we're struggling here, I think, because we have two things we're trying to do. We're trying to fill some reserve accounts so that we can do a total rate of return model to help all of you. The treasurer said it best, and I completely concur that we're trying to make Wyoming dollars work harder for Wyoming.
Absolutely. No question.
Multiple avenues we're trying to go down with the same buck that we're trying to do all these things at once, and it's just a challenge. So I guess my point is, we've heard about this 2 or 3 times now.
Yeah.
I think if we're ever going to do anything, let's do it. And so I'd ask that we have a bill drafted. This is going to be very conceptual. I hope the committee will kick in some ideas and things. But I would name it the School Generational Fund to fill in the property tax gap that may or may not come forward because property taxes pay for our schools. I'd start it at $100 million if we could find that. If there was a one-time school payment coming into the state of Wyoming, maybe we could start by filling the account with that one-time payment. And because of where the source is, I think that's why we'd have to start it on the school side, because if school property is sold, then it has to go into the corpus. So hopefully we could do something in that regard. So I would say in this bill, if a one-time payment comes in between 80 and $100 million, up to 100 would go into this school generational fund. And that's if that money comes in by the end of 2025. No withdrawals from this account for a minimum of 9 years, trying to give you a couple-year cushion on your rule of 72, so that we could at least double that 100 once before a future legislature raids the account and says, hey, this isn't working, or this dream is not floating quite the way we'd like. And then from there, Patrick, what are some other parameters that you see to make this succeed that we should include in this bill?
Mr. Chairman,
Broad outline parameters. I'm not saying we have to fill in every gap right this second.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think you really pointed out the main thesis of what we're trying to do. And when you're talking about school fund, if there was any other types of income coming from other land parcel sales or anything like that, potentially could go into this or something like that. And then as far as the construct of the fund, is just leaving it much more open and not having the requirements that we have in any of the other funds. So that would really be the key, as the treasurer mentioned, that you're not distributing, you're not beholden to try and get this 5% income, you are maximizing your total rate of return.
Now, there's a timing problem, perhaps, with that putting it into the foundation and not putting that, I guess you're talking about the Jackson land sale, and it's.
Talking about any land we may be able to get rid of in the next year.
Yeah, Well, you see, if
Anything.
it.
I'm not talking about anything in particular. It's just a
Yeah.
matter of saying, because you're right, there are some timing issues, but I think we could do some swaps internally to where we
Yeah.
could come up with, because this would really be the only place that I envision excess money becoming available that would be available on a one-time shot. And if you're going to do a generational fund like this, it makes sense to do it with one-time monies. And so how do you maximize
And
those
it really
one-time
makes
monies?
sense not to spend that one-time money and to make sure you can get the most out of it for the purposes of the fund. I don't know whether we can partition that 100 million within the school foundation, because that's, that could be a little tricky. But
Figure it out.
I think I think you want to try to get that money before the end of the year, because the statute says that as soon as that the governor certifies that subsection D about the stuff in Sweetwater County, and I've been talking to the folks in Jackson. They say that they have talked to Clark Stith, and Clark Stith says, yeah, this has been met. But I would put a poison pill in that contract, and I would say that if for any reason in the future that this provision D has been infringed upon or subjugated in any manner, then essentially they forfeit the $100 million and the deed to the land.
And I think we're getting off on a whole different
I
subject
know,
there,
but
Treasurer
I know
Meyer.
we're
and
getting on a
so we're gonna
different
we're gonna
subject area,
stop there
but
and
I'm
get
saying
back to our
we wanna
bill
protect
draft.
ourselves on that.
I agree. We're gonna stop there and get back on track of this generational fund that is your great idea. Senator Guru, what would you like to see in this generational fund?
Well, I like your point. I mean, from all the conversations we've had about this over your time in office, we've always talked about all the impediments that are now sitting with those permanent funds, the things that we can't do. So I think the key would be I look at this as like a pilot project. Where the money comes from, that doesn't matter at this point. Although, yeah, there might be an idea or two floating around out there, but the point is if we're drafting something, to be able to draft something with your help to make sure that it's constructed. So as a pilot, to say, this is all the times we've talked about all the impediments. We're gonna parcel this off so we can show, because that's always a hard part when we talk about this, trying to sell this on the floor. So this is your chance to see all the things that you've been talking about and to put together a vehicle to say, this is what the future could be with all the funds. If we could then go to a constitutional change, go somewhere else, if it works as well as we think, and be able to do that. So that's why I'd like to see this constructed, in that way, and parcel it out and call it that, call it a pilot project, to say, this is the glimpse of the future. This is what can be done.
Yeah.
And that's what the key is, to be able to talk about this when we're out there around trying to sell this idea.
Yeah, and I think it's reasonable from the standpoint of, and looking at pacing schedule, that, that if you had 100 million for 5 years, that's almost as good as getting 500 million in the first year, because you don't want to put it all to work in 1 year, in one vintage. So the pacing makes sense, and I think a 5-year area would work like that, and I think we could talk to Patrick and see how much we could put in those different things. I think you probably, if you're going to get 500 million a year, I think you figure out how to invest it, but.
I think the other thing to add is, yes, that additional deposits can go in.
Yes.
But each of those deposits would be constrained by the 9-year withdrawal limitation. So if in year 2, 50 million went in, that 50 million would start at 2026. And then if, and so that it wouldn't be at year 9, the entire thing could be liquidated. It would only be the amount that was deposited on year 1 would be eligible for withdrawal on year 9. Something to that effect. And so if Ian and Brian, you guys will work with the Treasurer's Office to help fill in some of these gaps, create what's needed. Because I think Senator Gru has a great point. This isn't a PMTF. this, we want to make sure earnings and not interest are incorporated. We want to make sure that we address all the other impediments that we've seen in our other investing to create this, because this is the new generation model of funding, and so. Senator Grew?
Yeah, the point I was trying to make, yeah, I agree totally with your idea that other monies could go in, but it has to be written, when it's written in draft form, that any dollars that go into it are in the same construct as the first payment, because the PTMF didn't get this way all at once. It was incremental. And so that's what would be the problem going forward. Well-intentioned folks would say, well, this 10 million is gonna go in, but we're gonna need to, then there'll be a flow chart. And it's gonna go here, and then it's gonna go there. I know that's never happened before, but if we could, what we wanna do is get away from that with this fund and say, this all goes one way towards that total concept that you're talking about.
I think you start with the skeleton, and we're just gonna put a lot of meat on the bones.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is gonna be I think it's a really good idea, and it'll be an evolutionary thing as we start building this thing out. I mean, I've had conversations with the treasurer, and there's a number of things that we can start. It just depends on what the legislature's inclined to do. How do you create a perpetual revenue stream to fund the thing? And so I think we have to contemplate what that looks like. How much do we seed it with? Is it 100 million out of the LSRA, or do we use the unrealized, unprofiled capital gains, and 50% of those roll into that every year? There's just so many mechanisms to look at, but I think you got to get the bones put together, the framework. Let's get that, and I think Chairman's right. Let's get something drafted up to start that framework that just sets up the account and some of the policies that associate, not unviolate for 10 years, all earnings or go right back into the corpus, those type of things. The other thing is, where we seed it and how we feed it are discussions that let's get the infrastructure set up.
And maybe have that a separate section so we can amend it out real simple where the funding comes in and out and whatnot, but
There's a lot of
make it a very
discussions
divisible
that we
bill
can
so
have.
we can keep portions if we want and get rid of others.
Mr. Chairman, the other thing
Senator Hicks.
that I'm curious is maybe to have LSO opine on it would be, do we create a whole new other account, or do we create a account in an existing, it gets back to how many buckets and all of this stuff. And I'm also interested in the treasurers. I mean, you could potentially go in there and set a sub-account within the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund or the Common School Permanent Land Fund. But these are intergenerational allocations within those existing funds versus create whole new other accounts. And so just something, again, to consider, what's the most efficient way to do that versus, and it may just be created whole other accounts, I guess. Ian, you want to opine?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would just say something very general in that regard. I think that it would make sense to combine it with another account if it has similarities in purpose or similarities in its funding source. But I wouldn't necessarily think that, attaching it to the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, for example, if it's not going to be put into the general fund or has no intent intends to be invested in other things, that would make a lot of sense. And particularly if at this point it's a experiment to where it will eventually be invested in 10 or 20 or 40 years from now, might be better to operate independently. Particularly since, I think the Treasurer's Office testimony over the years has been the problem with the multiple accounts is all the flow charts and the fact that they have to figure that out every year where it goes. This account's not going to be used, and so it avoids those administrative burdens.
And Mr. Chairman, to that extent, as far as the governance, I was more inclined to give the IFC more governance authority over this, because it doesn't take necessarily the day-to-day oversight by the treasurer's office, because it should be something that's going to go forward without that day-to-day interference by either our office or hopefully the legislative bodies, that it actually gets to grow. And it'd be kind of out of sight, out of mind. You'd get an annual report on the fund from the IFC once a year. And then, the treasurer's still on that. I can walk away for something that's not necessarily what our inherent duties have, and looking at something that is really for the future of the state, And so, I can, if it takes that to get the governor on board and make it, and so he doesn't veto the damn thing, I can walk away from some of that stuff, okay? So I'm not, I guess I am negotiating against myself right now, which is a place
Senator
you
Garud.
shouldn't be.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So are we okay then in asking for a bill draft of just putting together the construct of the premise of this idea to bring to our next meeting, this fund?
Mr. Chairman, I think so. And I think it's already been decided, but this is the idea, it's a statutory fund, correct?
Yes.
Not an
Correct.
attempt to put it in the Constitution.
And just say, keep it simple. And with those sideboards, as far as, what we're looking for here, which we've all discussed. And then we can bring that and then we'll take a look at it. Is that fair? Sound okay? Yeah. Mr. Chairman, they love it.
We love the idea.
Love.
We're going to
There's a
keep
lot of love
talking
in
about
this
it.
room.
Well,
I can
we just
feel it.
will have a bill draft so we can start doing something with it. Okay, any other comments on the generational fund? No other comments on the generational fund. With that, I think we have wrapped up today's business. Ian or Brian, anyone with LSO staff, any final comments?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think so, other than, as you mentioned, I think our next meeting is on October 30th in Cheyenne.
October 30th, Cheyenne. Hope everyone can make it, as we will need a quorum to vote on all of these bills. Representative Larson. We may start at 6 a.m. and plan to stay till 10 p.m.
I'll cook breakfast. Bring your jammies. I'll bring breakfast.
All right, with that, meeting is adjourned.